The morning shift at the Galactic Trade Center on Proxima Station began like any other day. Junior technician Zethkar walked through the docking bay with his usual cup of bitter Therian coffee, checking the massive cargo ships that lined the station's outer ring. The familiar hum of fusion engines and the chatter of different alien languages filled the air as workers prepared for another busy day of interstellar commerce. But something was wrong. Zethkar stopped in front of Docking Bay 12, where Captain Jake Morrison's cargo vessel, the Meridian, should have been sitting. The bay was empty, not just empty, but clean. Too clean. The usual scorch marks from engine burns were gone, and the loading equipment had been neatly stacked against the walls. Zethkar pulled out his datapad and checked the departure logs. Nothing, no clearance codes, no flight plans, no exit permits. According to the station's computer, the Meridian was still docked. But the bay was clearly empty. He ran to the next docking bay. Empty. The next one. Empty. Bay after bay. That had housed human ships just yesterday now stood vacant. Zethkar's forearms trembled as he activated his communication device. Control center, this is Zethkar in the cargo section. We have a problem. The voice that answered belonged to Station Commander Vexthal, a veteran crystalline who had run Proxima Station for 30 years. What kind of problem, technician? The human ships, sir. They're all gone. A long pause. Define gone. Gone as in not here anymore, sir. Every single human vessel that was docked for maintenance. They're just not here. Within minutes, the station's emergency protocols activated. Security teams swept through every section of the massive facility. The results were the same everywhere. Human ships had vanished without a trace. Not just the big cargo haulers, but the small personal craft, the diplomatic vessels, even the maintenance shuttles. Commander Vexthal stood in the central command center, his crystalline body pulsing with confused orange light. Around him, dozens of alien technicians worked frantically at their stations, trying to make sense of what had happened. "Sir," called out Communications Officer Crickstall, "I'm getting similar reports from stations across the sector. Station Arcturus reports all human vessels missing. New Geneva Station says the same thing. The pattern is consistent everywhere." The commander's light shifted to worried purple. "Are you telling me that every human ship in this sector has disappeared simultaneously?" "That's what it looks like, sir." As the hours passed, the scope of the disappearance became clear. It wasn't just one sector. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy. Every human colony, every human station, every human ship had vanished overnight. The bustling human settlements that had dotted the galactic rim were now empty shells. Their automated systems still functioning, but their inhabitants gone. On the mining world of Kepler 442b, Foreman Grixenok discovered that the human mining team led by Supervisor Amy Wells had simply vanished. Their equipment was still running, their quarters were clean and organized, but the humans were nowhere to be found. The mining operation that had employed 200 humans and 500 aliens ground to a halt as the alien workers stared at empty offices and abandoned workstations. Lieutenant Susan Price's final transmission from the lunar base had been a routine status update at 0347 hours. All systems normal, next check-in at 040, but when 040 came, there was only silence. The base's automated systems continued their functions, but the humans who had operated them were gone. The Vorthek Trade Consortium tried desperately to reach Director Amy Wells on Terra Nova, but found only automated messages. The colony's computers answered with pre-recorded responses, but no human voices came through the communication channels. The bustling markets where human traders had negotiated deals for exotic goods from across the galaxy now echoed with only alien voices. Confused and increasingly worried, Dr. Velenok, a respected Therian economist, was among the first to grasp the true scope of the crisis. Humans hadn't just been participants in galactic civilization. They had been its backbone. Their ships carried goods between worlds that had no other means of trade. Their diplomatic missions prevented conflicts that would have erupted into wars. Their technological innovations kept the complex systems of interstellar society running smoothly. As the first day without humans ended, the galaxy held its breath. Surely this was some kind of mistake. Maybe a massive communication failure. Maybe the humans had encountered some emergency and would return soon with explanations. The alien species that had grown accustomed to human presence for the past 2 centuries couldn't imagine a galaxy without them, but as the second day dawned on stations and colonies across the galaxy, the empty spaces where humans had been remained. Empty, no explanations came, no messages were received. Humanity had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the growing realization that the galaxy they had all known was gone forever. 3 months had passed since the humans disappeared, and the galaxy was beginning to show the first signs of strain. What had started as confusion and worry was slowly transforming into something much more dangerous. The careful balance that had maintained peace between dozens of alien species for generations was starting to crack. The Zephyrian Empire was the first to test the new reality. Their warships, sleek and dangerous, began appearing near the border systems that separated them from the Centauri Alliance. For 200 years, these borders had been respected, maintained by a series of peace treaties that Ambassador Chris Taylor had negotiated with his usual patience and skill. But Chris Taylor was gone, along with every other human diplomat, and the Zephyrians were quick to notice. High Commander Zixthal of the Zephyrian fleet stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying the tactical display that showed Centauri patrol ships in the distance. His scaled face showed the slight smile that his species wore when they sensed weakness. "They're alone now," he told his second-in-command. "No human peacekeepers to run crying to. No diplomatic immunity to hide behind, just them and us." The first skirmish happened near the asteroid belt that marked the contested zone between the two empires. A Zephyrian mining vessel, escorted by 3 warships, began extracting valuable minerals from rocks that had been claimed by the Centauri Alliance for decades. When Centauri patrol ships arrived to investigate, they found the Zephyrians waiting. With weapons charged, the battle lasted only minutes, but it was the first armed conflict between major powers in over a century. 3 Centauri ships were destroyed and 2 Zephyrian vessels were damaged. More importantly, the fragile peace that had protected billions of beings across the galaxy had been shattered. The economic problems started showing up around the same time. The vast network of trade routes that connected distant worlds had been built and maintained by human shipping companies. Captain Roy Martinez had been responsible for organizing cargo runs between 17 different star systems. His company alone had employed over 3,000 alien workers and transported goods worth billions of credits every month. Now his ships were gone, and the worlds that depended on those supply lines were beginning to feel the shortage. On Arcturus Prime, the alien population faced their first food crisis in generations. The agricultural systems that had been set up by engineer Lisa Grant's team were complex and required constant maintenance. Without human technicians to keep them running, the automated farms began failing one by one. Dr. Kexival, the Thurian administrator who ran the food distribution center on Arcturus Prime, watched his supply numbers drop each day. The synthetic protein processors that had fed millions of beings were breaking down, and no one knew how to fix them. The instruction manuals were written in human languages, and the replacement parts came from human factories that no longer existed. "We have maybe 6 weeks of emergency supplies left," he told the Planetary Council. "After that, we're looking at mass starvation." Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy. The delicate web of interstellar commerce that had sustained countless civilizations was falling apart. Human traders hadn't just moved goods from place to place. They had understood the complex relationships between supply and demand, between different species' needs and capabilities. They had been the glue that held the galactic economy together. The Vorthic Trade Consortium, one of the oldest commercial organizations in the galaxy, called an emergency meeting. Their leaders sat around a massive table in their headquarters on Proxima Station, trying to figure out how to fill the gaps left by human disappearance. "The humans handled 60% of our shipping contracts," reported Trade Director Vex Moon. "They managed our currency exchanges, our insurance policies, our cargo security. We don't even know how half of these systems work without them." The cultural impact was perhaps even more devastating than the economic one. Humans had been natural bridge builders, able to work with any species, understand any culture. They had served as translators not just of languages, but of entire ways of thinking. Without them, the different alien species found themselves struggling to communicate even basic concepts. On the research station orbiting Kepler-6 a joint scientific project involving 5 different species ground to a halt. The project had been coordinated by Dr. Helen Ross, a human xenobiologist who had spent years learning to work with beings whose minds operated in completely different ways. Her alien colleagues tried to continue the work, but without her patient guidance, their cultural differences became insurmountable obstacles. Dr. Velenok, the Thurian economist who had been among the first to understand the scope of the crisis, published a report that sent shockwaves through government circles across the galaxy. His analysis was simple and terrifying. Humans hadn't just been participants in galactic civilization. They had been its foundation. Their disappearance had created a void that no single species could fill. We built our entire society around the assumption that humans would always be there, he wrote. They were our mediators, our innovators, our connectors. Without them, we're not a galactic civilization anymore. We're just a collection of isolated species slowly drifting apart. The report spread quickly through diplomatic channels, and the reaction was immediate. Panic buying began on dozens of worlds as governments tried to stockpile essential supplies. Trade agreements that had existed for decades were suddenly canceled as each species focused on protecting their own interests. The galaxy that had once been united by human presence was beginning to fragment, and the cracks were growing wider. Every day, the 6th month after humanity's disappearance brought a new level of desperation to the galaxy. The alien governments that had once competed with each other for trade deals and territory now faced a common crisis that threatened them all. Hi. Chancellor Krickstall of the Andromedan Council stood before the emergency assembly, his blue-scaled face showing the strain of sleepless nights. We cannot continue to pretend that the humans will simply return, he told the gathered representatives. Every day we wait, our civilizations crumble a little more. We must act now, before it's too late. The emergency coalition formed that day, bringing together species that had barely spoken to each other in centuries. The Thurians, the Crystallins, the Vorthek, the Centauri, even the proud Zephyrians put aside their differences to focus on one goal, finding the humans and bringing them back. The search operation was massive. Thousands of ships from dozens of different species spread across the galaxy, visiting every world that humans had ever touched. They followed old trade routes, investigated abandoned mining stations, and scanned empty space for any sign of where humanity might have gone. Dr. Vexthal, a respected Andromedan scientist, led the investigation team that arrived at the human colony of New Geneva. The city that had once housed 2 million humans and aliens was now a ghost town. The buildings stood empty but intact, their windows dark and their streets silent. Automated systems still maintained the basic functions, but the life that had once filled the colony was gone. "Look at this," called out his assistant, pointing to a massive data center in the colony's central district. "The main computers have been wiped clean, not damaged, not destroyed, carefully erased." The investigation team found similar patterns. Everywhere they looked, human colonies hadn't been abandoned in panic or destroyed by some catastrophe. They had been systematically evacuated, with important data and equipment removed with careful precision. It was as if the humans had planned their departure for months, maybe years. On the industrial world of Titan VII, security footage revealed even more disturbing evidence. The recording showed Foreman Danny Cooper, a human who had managed the planet's fusion reactors for over a decade, methodically shutting down systems and backing up critical data. He worked alone, during night shifts when most of the alien workers were asleep. He knew exactly what he was doing, reported Security Chief Grixenok to the investigation team. Every shutdown followed proper safety protocols. Every backup was complete. This wasn't sabotage. This was preparation. Similar scenes played out across dozens of worlds. On the educational planet of New Geneva, Teacher Helen Ross had been recorded backing up the entire school database, transferring educational programs and student records to portable storage devices. Her alien colleagues had thought she was simply updating the system, but now they realized she had been preparing for departure. The most unsettling discovery came from the shipping records. Captain Roy Martinez, whose cargo company had been one of the largest in the galaxy, had filed unusual manifests in the weeks before the disappearance. His ships had been carrying mysterious containers marked only as personal effects to coordinates that led to empty space. They were taking something with them, Dr. Vexthal reported to the Coalition Council. Not just their belongings, but something important enough to risk exposure. Something they needed wherever they were going. The investigation revealed that humans had been quietly selling off assets across the galaxy for at least 2 years before their disappearance. Property deeds, mining rights, even shares in major corporations had been transferred to alien partners at surprisingly low prices. At the time, it had seemed like humans were simply diversifying their investments. Now it looked like they had been liquidating their entire galactic presence. Trade Director Vex Moon of the Vorthak Consortium discovered that human companies had been gradually reducing their long-term contracts, switching to shorter agreements that would expire around the time of the disappearance. They were winding down their operations, he explained, to the Coalition. Slowly, carefully, so we wouldn't notice until it was too late. The investigation team on the research station orbiting Kepler 62c found perhaps the most telling evidence. Dr. Linda Parker, a human xenobiologist who had worked closely with alien researchers for decades, had left behind a personal log that wasn't discovered until months after her disappearance. The decision wasn't made lightly, her recorded voice explained. We've spent generations trying to help, trying to build something better. But every time we solve one problem, 3 more appear. Every time we prevent one war, 2 more start brewing. The galaxy doesn't need us to survive. It needs us to learn to survive without us. The log continued with detailed explanations of human technology, diplomatic protocols, and economic systems. It was as if Dr. Parker had been trying to leave behind a manual for maintaining galactic civilization without human involvement. We're not abandoning you, the recording concluded. We're giving you the chance to become what you were always meant to be. The galaxy belongs to all of us, not just to those who happen to be good at holding it together. The Emergency Coalition studied the evidence for weeks, trying to understand where the humans might have gone. The coordinates from the shipping manifests led to empty space in the galactic rim, far from any inhabited systems. Long-range sensors detected nothing unusual, but the area was too vast to search thoroughly. As the investigation continued, one thing became clear. Humanity's departure had been the most carefully planned operation in galactic history. They had spent years preparing, ensuring that their absence would be noticed but not catastrophic. They had left behind enough information for the other species to eventually figure out how to maintain civilization without them. The question that haunted every member of the Coalition was simple. If the humans had gone to such lengths to leave, what could possibly convince them to return? The first anniversary of humanity's disappearance passed without celebration. Instead, it marked the beginning of the galaxy's darkest period in over 1,000 years. The Emergency Coalition had spent months searching for answers, but their efforts had only revealed how thoroughly the humans had planned their departure. Now, as the search continued with diminishing hope, the consequences of that absence were spreading like wildfire across civilized space, the Vortex Centauri. War had escalated beyond anyone's worst fears. What had started as a minor border dispute over asteroid mining rights had grown into a full-scale conflict that threatened to consume entire star systems. Fleet Admiral Zixfil of the Zephyrian Empire watched the destruction from his command ship, his scaled face showing grim satisfaction. "Look how they tear each other apart," he told his officers. "Without their precious human mediators, they're nothing but animals." The battle for the Kepler 62 system raged for 3 weeks. The Vorthak fleet, desperate to secure the system's rare mineral deposits, launched a massive assault on Centauri defensive positions. The Centauri Alliance responded with everything they had, turning the space around the system's primary star into a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen corpses. In the end, both sides lost. The Vorthak fleet was destroyed, but the Centauri forces were so damaged that they couldn't hold the system. Pirates and scavengers moved in to claim the wreckage, while the civilian population on the system's inhabited worlds faced starvation and chaos. Ambassador Kevin Hill would have prevented the war with a single diplomatic meeting. His patient negotiations had resolved dozens of similar conflicts over the years, finding solutions that satisfied all parties. But Kevin Hill was gone along with every other human diplomat, and the galaxy was learning what happened when disputes were settled by force instead of words. The technological disasters were equally devastating. The Great Space Elevator on Kepler 62c, a marvel of engineering that had connected the planet's surface to orbital stations for over a century, collapsed on a Tuesday morning. The massive structure, built under the supervision of engineer Rachel Clark, had required constant maintenance and careful monitoring. Without human technicians to keep it running, the automated systems had gradually failed Dr. Kexival. The Therian administrator, who had once worried about food shortages, now faced a much bigger problem. The collapse of the space elevator had cut off the planet's main link to space. Millions of tons of food and supplies that had been scheduled for delivery were now stranded in orbit, while the planet's surface population faced complete isolation. "We have maybe 3 months of supplies left," he reported to the Planetary Council. "After that, we'll have to start rationing everything. Food, medicine, even basic tools. The elevator took decades to build, and we don't have the expertise to repair it." Similar disasters struck dozens of worlds. The fusion reactors that powered the cities of New Geneva began showing signs of instability. The atmospheric processors that kept the air breathable on terraformed worlds started breaking down. The quantum communication networks that connected distant colonies began failing as relay stations went offline. The humans hadn't just operated these systems. They had understood them. They had trained alien technicians, but only to handle routine maintenance. The complex problems that required real expertise, the kind of deep understanding that came from years of study and experience, had been left to human specialists who were no longer available. Social fabric began tearing apart as species that had coexisted peacefully for generations turned against each other. The multi-species crews that had worked on human vessels found themselves unable to function without human leadership. Captain Steve Peterson had commanded a ship with crew members from 12 different species, managing their different needs and cultural conflicts with natural authority. Now those same crew members were scattered across the galaxy, many of them unemployed and bitter. The Thurians blamed the crystallines for taking their jobs. The Vorthak accused the Centauri of stealing their trade routes. Old prejudices that had been buried for centuries resurfaced with frightening speed. On Proxima Station, the great meeting place where dozens of species had once traded and socialized together, segregation became the norm. The Zephyrians claimed the upper levels, forcing other species to use the lower decks. The Thurians established their own section, refusing to serve non-Thurian customers. The crystallines retreated to areas where their specific atmospheric needs could be met. Station. Commander Vexel tried to maintain order, but his authority meant little without the respect that human administrators had once commanded. "We're falling apart," he confided to his deputy. "Without the humans to keep us together, we're just going back to what we were before, separate, suspicious, and afraid." The younger generation of aliens, those who had grown up alongside humans, struggled the most. They had been raised to believe that differences between species were just obstacles to overcome, that cooperation was natural and beneficial. Now they watched their elders abandon everything they had been taught. Zixara, a young Thurian who had been educated in human schools, found herself managing refugee camps on her homeworld. The camps were filled with beings from dozens of different species, all of them displaced by the various conflicts and disasters that had followed humanity's departure. "My human teacher used to say that diversity made us stronger," she told a group of refugee children. She said that every species brought something valuable to the galaxy. I believed her then. I want to believe her now. The children, a mix of different species who had never known a galaxy without conflict, looked at her with confused eyes. They had no memory of the peace that had once existed, no understanding of how different things used to be. As the first anniversary passed and the second year began, the galaxy settled into a new pattern. It was a pattern of conflict, scarcity, and isolation. The great age of cooperation and expansion that had lasted for centuries was over, replaced by a struggle for survival that consumed more resources than it created. The stars still shone, and life continued on millions of worlds, but the dream of a united galactic civilization had died with humanity's departure. 3 years had passed since the humans vanished, and the galaxy had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to those who had lived through the golden age of interstellar cooperation. The emergency coalition that had once brought different species together in a desperate search for humanity had dissolved into competing factions. Each one focused only on the survival of their own kind. The Galactic Council, once a beacon of interspecies cooperation that had governed hundreds of worlds, had become little more than a memory. The Great Assembly Hall on Central Station, where representatives from dozens of species had once debated policy and trade agreements, now stood empty except for the automated systems that still maintained basic life support. Elder Vexthal of the Crystalline Collective walked through the ruins of what had once been the bustling central market on Proxima Station. His crystalline body, now dulled with age and stress, pulsed with dim purple light as he surveyed the destruction. Where human trader Rick Sanders had once negotiated deals that benefited everyone involved, now only empty stalls remained. The careful balance of supply and demand that humans had, orchestrated with such skill, had given way to something much cruder and more destructive. The Vorthek had cornered the market on rare minerals, driving prices so high that smaller species couldn't afford basic tools. The Zephyrions controlled most of the shipping lanes, charging massive fees that crippled trade between distant worlds. We used to complain about human regulations, Vexthal told his aide, a young crystalline named Crixmoon. We said they were too controlling, too involved in everyone's business. Now look what we've built without them. The economic networks that had sustained billions of beings across thousands of worlds had collapsed into a patchwork of black markets and protection rackets. The Thurian crime families, once kept in check by human law enforcement, now controlled entire sectors. They sold food to starving worlds at inflated prices, offered protection to cargo ships for huge fees, and eliminated competitors with the kind of violence that hadn't been seen in civilized space for centuries. Dr. Kexival, who had once worried about food shortages on Arcturus Prime, now oversaw a planet that had regressed to subsistence farming. The advanced agricultural systems that had once fed millions had been stripped for parts, sold to off-world buyers who promised to repair them but never returned. The planet's population, once numbering in the hundreds of millions, had dropped to less than 50 million as beings fled to other worlds or simply died from starvation and disease. We're not a civilized world anymore, he admitted to the handful of government officials who still showed up for meetings. We're just a collection of survivors, trying to grow enough food to last another season. The technological regression was visible everywhere. The sleek starships that had once carried passengers and cargo between worlds had been replaced by crude vessels that barely maintained life support. The quantum communication networks that had allowed instant contact across the galaxy had been reduced to scattered relay stations that worked only when they weren't being raided by pirates, the great universities where human professors had taught advanced sciences to eager alien students had closed their doors. The research stations that had pushed the boundaries of knowledge had been abandoned or converted into military bases. The medical centers that had shared treatments and cures across species lines had become exclusive, facilities that served only those who could afford to pay. On the mining world of Titan VII, the massive fusion reactors that had once powered industrial operations across 3 star systems had been shut down permanently. The alien workers who had once operated under human supervision lacked the knowledge to maintain such complex systems. One by one, the reactors had suffered critical failures, and each failure had taken another piece of galactic infrastructure with it. The younger generation of aliens, those who had grown up with humans as friends and teachers, struggled to understand what had happened to their world. Zixara, the young Thurian who had been educated in human schools, stood in the ruins of her old classroom on New Geneva. The building had been abandoned for 2 years, its windows broken and its walls covered with graffiti. "My teacher Carol Wright used to stand right here," she told the small group of children who had gathered around her. "She taught us that every species had something valuable to contribute to the galaxy. She said that our differences made us stronger, not weaker." The children, most of them refugees from various conflicts, listened with the kind of attention that suggested they were hearing about a fairy tale rather than recent history. They had never known a time when different species worked together willingly. They had never seen the kind of cooperation that had once been taken for granted. "What happened to her?" asked a small crystalline child, her body pulsing with curious yellow light. "She went away," Zixara answered, though the words felt inadequate. "They all went away." The truth was that no one really knew what had happened to the humans. The emergency coalition had searched for 3 years, following every lead and investigating every theory. They had found evidence of careful planning, of systematic withdrawal, of deliberate preparation for departure, but they had never found a single clue about where humanity had gone or why they had chosen to leave. Some believed that the humans had found a new galaxy, a place where they could start fresh without the burden of holding together, a civilization that seemed determined to tear itself apart. Others thought that they had simply died out, victims of some plague or disaster that they had chosen to face alone rather than risk spreading to other species. The most disturbing theory, whispered in the dark corners of stations and colonies across the galaxy, was that the humans had never intended to stay permanently, that they had always known that their role as mediators and peacekeepers would eventually become unnecessary, and that they had planned their departure as the final lesson they could teach the galaxy. As Zixara stood in the ruins of her old school, watching refugee children play games that involved fighting rather than cooperation, she wondered if that theory might be true. The humans had spent generations trying to teach other species how to work together, how to solve problems without violence, how to build something better than what had come before. Maybe their departure hadn't been an abandonment at all. Maybe it had been a final exam, a test to see if the lessons they had taught had really been learned. If that was true, then the galaxy was failing that test badly. A decade had passed since humanity's silent departure, and the galaxy had settled into a new reality that bore little resemblance to the vibrant civilization that had once spanned the stars. The great empires that had once controlled hundreds of worlds had contracted to single-star systems, their fleets reduced to patrol ships that barely maintained order within their own borders. The age of exploration and expansion, driven by human curiosity and ambition, had ended not with a bang but with a whimper. On the planet that had once been called New Geneva, now known simply as Colony 7, the last generation of aliens who remembered the time before humanity's departure gathered in what had been the planetary library. The building was smaller now, its upper floors sealed off to save energy, its vast collection of books and data files reduced to a few shelves of essential information. Solmer, an aged Andromedan librarian whose blue scales had faded to gray, over the years carefully preserved the remaining records of human civilization. His work had become a lonely obsession, driven by the belief that future generations needed to understand what had been lost. Among the documents he guarded most carefully was a personal log from Dr. Linda Parker, a human xenobiologist who had dedicated her life to fostering understanding between species. "I found this in the archives of the old research station," Solmer explained to his assistant, a young Thurian named Kexthel, who had volunteered to help with the preservation work. "It was recorded just days before they all disappeared." The log was simple and direct. Spoken in the calm voice of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision, Dr. Parker had worked with alien researchers for over 30 years, helping them understand not just human biology but human thinking. Her final entry revealed the depth of humanity's frustration with their role in galactic society. "We tried to teach them to solve their own problems," her voice said through the old speakers. "Every time we mediated a dispute, we explained our reasoning. Every time we prevented a war, we showed them how diplomacy could work. Every time we fixed a broken system, we left behind detailed instructions for maintenance." Solmer had listened to the recording hundreds of times, but it still made him feel hollow inside. The log continued with Dr. Parker's observations about the various species she had worked with, their strengths and weaknesses, their potential for growth and cooperation. The Therians have natural empathy, but they struggle with long-term planning. The crystallines think in centuries, but they have trouble understanding immediate needs. The Vorthak are excellent organizers, but they focus too much on hierarchy. The Zephyrians are natural leaders, but they see compromise as weakness. The recording painted a picture of species that had complementary abilities, each one capable of contributing something valuable to galactic civilization. But without humans to bridge the gaps between them, those differences had become sources of conflict rather than strength. "We hoped that by working together they would learn to see past their differences," Dr. Parker's voice continued. "We thought that if we showed them how cooperation could benefit everyone, they would choose to continue cooperating after we were gone." The log revealed that humanity's departure had been planned as a gradual process, designed to give other species time to adapt. But the plan had failed. Instead of learning to work together, the aliens had fractured into competing groups, each one convinced that their way was the only right way. Kexthel, who had been born years after the humans disappeared, struggled to understand the world that Dr. Parker described. "It sounds like paradise," he said. "Ships traveling freely between worlds, different species working together, conflicts resolved through talking instead of fighting. How could anyone give that up?" Solmer's response was tinged with the sadness of someone who had lived through both eras, because maintaining paradise is exhausting work. The humans spent centuries holding us together, preventing us from destroying ourselves. But they were tired, and they wanted us to learn to do it ourselves. The galaxy had learned, but not the lesson that humans had hoped to teach. The surviving civilizations had adapted to scarcity and conflict, developing new technologies focused on defense rather than exploration. They had learned to survive in isolation, to hoard resources rather than share them, to view other species as threats rather than partners. The great trade routes that had once connected distant worlds had been replaced by heavily guarded supply lines that served only specific alliances. The research stations that had pushed the boundaries of science had been converted into military installations. The cultural exchanges that had enriched countless civilizations had been abandoned in favor of rigid isolationism on Proxima Station. Now a shadow of its former self, the remaining population rarely ventured beyond their own species' sections. The great central plaza, where beings from dozens of worlds had once mingled freely, was now divided by barriers and checkpoints. The statue of the first human diplomat to visit the station had been removed years ago, its bronze surface melted. Down for scrap metal.coyx era, now middle-aged and serving as an administrator for the Therian refugee communities, sometimes walked through the empty corridors and remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about the old days. The stories seemed like legends now, tales of a golden age that might never have existed at all. "My grandmother used to say that humans could make anyone feel welcome," she told her own daughter, a young Therian who had never seen a member of another species up close. She said they had a gift for understanding what others needed, for finding solutions that worked for everyone. Her daughter listened politely, but Zixara could see the skepticism in her eyes. The younger generation had grown up in a galaxy of walls and barriers, where cooperation was seen as weakness and diversity was viewed as a source of problems rather than solutions. As Solmer sealed the archives that contained the last comprehensive Records of human civilization, he whispered a prayer in the old tongue. He hoped that somewhere among the stars, humanity had found the peace that had eluded them during their time as the galaxy's guardians. He hoped that they were happy wherever they had gone and that they sometimes remembered the civilizations they had left behind. The universe seemed smaller now, quieter, and infinitely more fragile without the steady presence of the species that had shown them all how to dream of tomorrow. The galaxy would survive, but it would never again reach the heights it had achieved when humans walked among the stars, building bridges between worlds and teaching others to reach for something better than mere survival.